Hello, welcome back everyone to my multi-part series on creating an Apex REST framework and creating your own endpoints in your Salesforce org. In today's video, we're going to go and get right to it and start making some API calls into our org, and we're going to be passing some data back. Before we do that, let's go over a little bit of what we touched on before. I showed you how to make a simple endpoint. I showed you how to generate an authentication token so that you can hit these endpoints. Those are in the previous videos if you want to check those out. And then today what we're going to do, we're going to go into our post request method that we set up in the first video. And we are going to retrieve the information or some data that is passed along from the API call into Salesforce, and then we are going to return some actual data back to the individual or entity or whatever that's actually making the API call. So to do this, I kind of have to set up a scenario, and the scenario I would like to set up is just a simple, hey, give me the information on an account you have in Salesforce. So I'm going to we're going to call this endpoint get account, right? And in this, you're going to pass an account ID, and I'm going to return the account. Now, you would never really create your own endpoint for this. Salesforce has endpoints out of the box endpoints through the normal Salesforce API that would allow you to do exactly what I'm doing here. But I really just wanted to show you, again, a very simple business case or a very simple use case on how you would on this. So it'll make the rest of this tutorial, I think, a little bit easier to understand as well. So again, so what do we need here? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to check the request that's coming in. I want the request to send a JSON body into our get account endpoint, and we need them to do it as a post request. If it's done as a post request, this HTTP post method will fire, and we can use the RestContext global class to understand the data that was passed in with that post request. But one thing that we don't have set up at the moment that we would need to set up first is some simple routing to understand which endpoint is being called. We could always set our endpoint directly up here in the URL mapping, but again, I want to make this API class kind of a global or a hub and a routing class to handle all future endpoints that we need to create. So I'm going to need to first know which endpoint is called, and to do that, I can pull the URI from the request. So I'm going to make a string URI is equal to in the rest context dot request, which holds all the information on the request coming in, and then I can grab this request URI. Great, and I'm going to do some really simple sanitation on this string just to make sure that that URI is in a lowercase format. Now, we are going to build out a very cool way to use these URIs to route to the proper methods that need to run. But for this video, I'm going to make this super simple, and I'm just going to run this if check here to see if the URI is equal to this get account endpoint that we're going to build out. And I don't think, yeah, I need 2. Can't put 3 equals in a string, right? Yep. Okay, and let's figure that out. Feel free to call me dumb in the comments. Okay, so if the URI is equal to this get account endpoint, we're going to run whatever's in this if block. Great. So what is it that we're trying to do in this block of code here? Well, the first thing we need to do is some really simple validation. We want to make sure that the endpoint request has an account ID in it. If it doesn't have an account ID, we have to send back an error saying, hey, we can't really do much without the account ID. This is what is expected in the post body. Then we're gonna, if it has an account ID, we're gonna use that account ID to find an account on our system, in our environment, and we'll check to make sure that there are results from that SOCL query. And if there are results, we're gonna return a response that includes the data of that account. Responses, I like to wrap my responses and work with my responses in Apex as their own individual classes. So I'm going to say public class, I'm going to say API, let's write this API response. And this public class is going to have a public Boolean called success. It's also going to contain a public object, because we don't know what it is that we want to put in here, called data. And just like we did for the response class, we will also want to cast the JSON body that comes in from the request into its own class as well. And I'm going to call that public class API request. And what we expect in this request is just it's a simple string value of an account ID. Now, you don't have to make classes and cast your requests into classes. There's other ways to do it. I like doing it this way for a lot of different reasons. I mean, the biggest one is like, if you have a lot of different API endpoints, it'll help kind of keep your head on straight as to what is expected to be sent into it, and then what we expect to return. So it does help there. But basically, like, what we want is the post body to include some type of JSON that looks like this, where it has the account ID and then some account ID, some Salesforce account ID in the post body. And this would be a string value that comes in from that post request. We'll then take this JSON and then we are going to cast it into that API request class, so that we can easily access that account ID for any future executable code that we write. So how do we do that? Well, luckily, Apex has a pretty robust JSON serialization and JSON deserialization system. But before we do that, we have to take the request body, so RestContext.request.request body, and we turn it into a string. ToString. Now that ToString is important because remember, the request body and the response body has the data type of a blob, which doesn't help us here. I'm then going to create a new API request class, and I'm going to call this API request, and it's going to be equal to, we have to cast it here. So I have to let Salesforce know that the deserializer is going to deserialize it into this API request class. So I actually have to write in parentheses here, API request. If you're not familiar with casting, just hang on tight. Like, it's not that hard. And but yeah, you just have to say API request and then JSON deserialize. We throw our JSON string in there, and then we provide the type. So API request.class. And that's going to turn that JSON string into that workable API request class. Pass JSON body into API request class. So what's next? Well, we have to make sure that there's an account ID, right? So now it's easy for us to do that. We can just say if API request dot account ID is equal to null, then what? Well, we should return some type of error. So I'm just going to say throw new exception here. You know what? We're not going to talk about exceptions right now. We'll do that in a later video. Let's do something else. Let's return a response. So I'm going to hit return here. And basically this return is just going to stop the execution of this method. And before it stops, I'm going to create a new API response class. I'm going to call this API response equals new API response. I say API response dot success is going to be equal to false. API response dot data. And again, this is an object. It can accept any data type. And I'm going to say there is new account ID. Great. And it'll return. So now if someone were to send and hit this API endpoint, and specifically the get account API endpoint, they're going to, and they don't include an account ID, we're going to send them back this response. To send back the response, we use our RestContext dot response, and it'll set the status code. It'll set it to 500, and RestContext dot response body is equal to, oh, well, I can't actually send this API, this class, into this body because it is a blob. So I have to convert this into a JSON string first, and then convert that JSON string into a blob. So a couple steps here we'll need to go over, but it is pretty simple. And in future videos, I'll show, we'll actually have like a response mechanism that handles all these steps for us. So it makes it really easy for us. But for now, let's go ahead and create another JSON string here. And we're going to use the Apex response string. That's a better idea. And we're going to use the Apex's JSON serialize method. And we're going to serialize our API response object. And then we just need to, this is going to turn this, well, let's do it here. And then what this will do is this will turn that API response object into JSON, and then we will create a blob.value of that JSON string into that request body. So again, just to recap here, there was no account ID. We're saying we're building a new API response object from the API response class. We're setting the success equal to false, and we're returning at 500. And we can see that here. Let's see if we can do it here. Let's say, I'm going to say get account. I'm going to capitalize that A just to test to make sure that our sanitation works. And when we hit send, we are going, this method will fire, and it should return a 500 error. So let's see here. But I have to send a body in. Let's send a body. It's going to be, again, we expect a JSON value here. So I'm going to say some key is equal, some key is associated with some value. And again, there's no account ID in there. And when I send that, I get our response in JSON. So success is false, and the data is there is no account ID. That is what we expected from this call. So that's awesome. But you can see here that it came back as text. We don't want that. We actually want the content to come back as JSON. So I need to set the headers of my response. And to do that, we just simply, again, go back to our API class here. We're going to go into our REST context dot response dot headers. And this headers property is a map string. So we'll just put content type, and we're going to set this to application JSON. So it's going to tell our Postman application that the way to interpret this data is as JSON and not as anything else. So great. So I'm going to give this another test, and we can hit send. I'm still sending the wrong information, so I should get the error, and I do. There's our success equals false, and there is no account ID variable. So just illustrating how you can change the data types or the type of response that's coming back. Okay, so what do we do now? Let's put in an account ID, and I'm going to go back to my org here and grab account go. I think I did create created a test account. I'm going to grab this ID and I'm going to go back to my Postman. I'm going to put this ID in our JSON body and we're going to hit send there. And I'm going to get no response. Well, that's interesting. Well, it's not exactly interesting because one, it did follow our URI, at least we think so. And then it had an account ID, so it didn't go into that block of code to send the response. And I have no response set if it has an account ID. So we're going to do that. So I'm going to say else. And we need to cast the request. Oh no, the request is already cast. That's right. And we need, what are we doing? We're going to create a list of accounts and we're going to query the accounts using the account ID that came in the post request. So I'm going to select, let's just select ID. Let's select the name from account where the ID is equal to. Put a colon there, and then API requests dot account ID. Right, so that should return some accounts. And then I'm going to check to see if that list is empty. So if it doesn't return any accounts, we'll need to throw another error. So we're going to do what we're doing here again, but we're just going to do it in this block of code. Let's update our response. Success is false, but still false, but I'm going to change the data to say no accounts match this ID. And I'm going to pass the ID back to the requester by saying API request.account ID there, concatenating that ID onto there. We're going to follow the same steps as above. So turning it into a JSON string, turning that JSON string into a blob, and sending that blob back into the response body. And then finally, we're going to say return. So we're going to end the execution of this method. Yeah, if you're looking at this, like, this is kind of not how I would write this, how this should be written. Just bear with me. We are going to show how to clean this up and make this a very seamless system in future videos. Right now, I just want to show what would happen if you were trying to send data back and forth. So now, finally, we need a way to, all our validations have been passed, and we're going to send a successful response. So I'm going to create a new API response, and I'm going to set the data equal to the account, or at least the first account in this list. And we're going to set the response success to true. And then we do the exact same thing we did when with the validations. So we're going to say response string is equal to this JSON serialize and our API response. And then we're going to pass, well, no, we got to set the headers, right? Rest context dot response dot status code. Let's do the status code first, and we'll make this a 200, and we're gonna set the headers here. All right, we're gonna put content type JSON, application JSON. That's better. And finally, we'll set the response body. Okay, is equal to the blob value, blob.value of our response string. Great. Do a quick look here. Okay. So let's see how that would work if we sent in an actual ID. It should hit this endpoint, fire off this if check, and should execute within this block of code here. So it'll turn our API request body into a JSON string, which casts it into our API request class, which allows us to easily work with the data that's been sent in from the API. We're going to do some validations here. We're going to send back errors if we need to send back errors. And then finally, if there are no errors and we have accounts, we're going to send back the first matching account in that from the SOCL response there. Because we're sending an ID, like there should only really be ever one record, but this will help prevent errors in the future. And again, like I'm not really worried so much about the use case or nuances in my code at the moment. I'm going to clean all this up in future videos, but I really just wanted to show how you would respond and how you can send data back and forth. And if you get, the most important thing you could take away from this part is how to do the routing, and then how to handle the casting of your request bodies and your response bodies. So let's see this work in real time. I'm going to make that same call that I made before. And yep, it's going to go to this get account endpoint that we created. Here's our account, or here's our post body. And let's fire it. Awesome. Now I got back, you can look at the response that I got back. This is what I expected. Success is equal to true. That's awesome. And then the data, which is just our account object that came from our SOCL query. And you can see here, I got my ID and the name, which are the two fields that we put in the SOCL query. So this is what we wanted. And again, you would never really set up your own endpoint to just pull a single account, but really what I'm trying to get across is just how to interact with it and understanding concepts like casting and sending data between the request and the response. So hopefully that resonated. In the next video, we're going to clean up that class and make the routing a little bit simpler. So I'll see you over there. Thanks.